Okay, 7th and 8th grade, we're starting a brand new chapter today. It's the new Millennium. So chapter 24, go ahead and get your notes out. We're starting it. That means that your homework for chapter 23 should be done. I'm not grading it right away, obviously, because you're going to turn your whole book in when we're done with this chapter. Make sure everything in your book is done, including test reviews. Those are not optional. If you don't turn in your test review, the book will just come right back to you because that is going to be your final test grade. So make sure that you have that done. Okay, so we're in chapter 24, A New Millennium, and we are going to start number 1. Throughout his presidency, Bill Clinton strove to align U.S. foreign policy with the United Nations. He wanted our independent nation to be very, very close in idea and culture as the United Nations, which is made up of countries from around the world, all with very, very different ideas of how things should be run. Many of those countries are very socialistic in their tendencies, and the United States is not, but we trade with them openly. But he was looking to make our foreign policy look a lot like the UN's foreign policy. The White House also made no effort to hide its sympathy with socialist and even communist regimes. There was a lot of visiting of communist and socialist regimes, and even declaring friendship between those two regimes. Okay, November 2000, Clinton flew to Vietnam, a communist nation, to meet with the communist leaders in Hanoi. And because he lifted trade sanctions, many American corporations had invested there. That enabled the communists to maintain oppressive control over people. The communist government was making money because American corporations moved factories there. They invested there. But the people themselves weren't making the money. It was the communist leaders that were making the money, which is what happens in every communist dictatorship in every time. Okay. By 2000, stock prices soared higher than ever before, but many stocks were trading at prices far above their value, which means that there was a false sense of security there. Gradually, the economy began to stall because eventually you can't keep up that high stock. And it began to stall under the burden of rising federal interest rates. Here's the thing about when you have people in Congress who are always looking to raise taxes, they see all that money and they want a piece of it, even if that money is artificially inflated. They say, well, there's money going around, we want a piece of that. So they began to raise the federal interest rates. There was also a decrease in consumer spending because of the high taxes. When people are taxed more, they spend less. And then there was a collapse of many internet-based companies, many of which were shorting their stocks. They were making their stocks look much, much more inflated in value than what they actually were. President Clinton often spoke of his desire to leave a legacy, but he didn't really leave one. His only real legacy is a string of scandals. When people look back now on his time in office, it's the scandals that just come up all the time. As the 2000 election neared, he won't be able to run for office again because he's already served 2 terms. So now they start looking at who can be the next president. Now, he belonged to the Democratic Party, so the Democratic Party is going to be looking for the highest ranking Democrat to run for president. They want to maintain that control in the White House. Why wouldn't they? That's their job as a presidential party. So they began to distance themselves from the president and Vice President Gore, looking for someone else to take over, but they came back to Gore. They really did, because even though there were a lot of scandals during Bill Clinton's presidency, and even though he was accused and convicted of sexual harassment for multiple women, accused by multiple women, convicted for one for sure. The women of the United States overall, those who consider themselves to be feminists in that most basic stance. I hate using the word feminist because I think there's some good that can come out of that. Belief that equal pay for equal work is really important. I'm not a big fan of the wage gap idea. I think people make choices and that reflects on their pay. But having equal protection of the law, I think, is absolutely standard. It should be a thing. But people who called themselves feminists during Bill Clinton's time, they were looking at him as being this great feminist leader, and the feminist women really loved him, despite the fact that he did exactly the opposite of what they thought, what they said a man should do, and the way he should treat women. So he was, it's very, very confusing to me as a woman who lived through it, who, I'm watching these women on the news, on the streets when they're doing protests and marching and rallies, and what was coming out of their mouths about wanting to be respected, wanting to be given the equal rights and everything, and then turning around saying how much they love Clinton because he loves women. And I'm like, but this is a guy who sexually harassed women while he was in positions of immense power, like governor of Arkansas, like president of the United States. This is a man who was accused of rape. This is a man who was accused of sexual harassment to a woman who was just like, back off of me, buddy. He ruined the reputation of his family. I don't look at him and think this is a man who loves women. I feel just the opposite, actually. But his family is going to move on. Bill Clinton is going to be out of office, and First Lady Hillary Clinton, and she started taking on she took her maiden name back. Hillary Rodham Clinton, that was her maiden name, Rodham. She began to look to become a senator. She wasn't really sure where she was going to be a senator from at first. Now, her husband had been governor of Arkansas, and so everybody was like, well, she'll probably be a senator from Arkansas. But she didn't want to be a senator from Arkansas because she saw Arkansas as being without a lot of power. She didn't like the idea that it was, it's just this little, boondock, nothing place. It's not. I mean, it's a beautiful place, but she wanted to be in a state that had a lot of political power. So she shopped around quite a bit. She went around to different places. She gave speeches. She looked to see how she was received. She claimed to be from just about everywhere she stopped. She went to Detroit and said, I'm a big fan of the music of the, Motown, it was like everywhere she went, she was like, I'm really from here, even if I wasn't born here or raised here or even lived here, I really embrace the people here. And she eventually decided she was going to become senator of New York. Now, in order for anyone to become a senator, they have to actually live in the state. She did not have a residence in New York State, so she had to purchase one. And she purchased a pretty large chunk of land near upstate New York and lived there. She had no place in New York until she began to campaign as a senator. So she moved there specifically to become a senator of New York. And she did become the first lady ever to be elected to the U.S. Senate. The Democratic Party and the liberal media were promoting Al Gore, who made a couple of claims that were quite interesting. For instance, he claimed, and he still does, that he invented the internet. He did not. There is an actual man who invented the internet. You actually had him on a different slideshow earlier. He is also a big-time climate change alarmist. He wrote a book about climate change and did a movie about climate change, most of the facts of which have been debunked because he predicted that by now we would be 20 feet underwater on our coastlines. That hasn't happened. He also has a gigantic house now that just ratchets up the money because it's not very efficient. Here's a guy who's pushing for climate change legislation. He wants the government to actually have control over climate change and tell people what to do, but he himself personally does not follow those same standards. He has a private jet, he has a huge house, and it is not very efficient. And then the Republican Party and most conservatives were rallying around George W. Bush because his father was George H.W. Bush, the president that was the man who was president right after Reagan. A lot of people didn't know a whole lot about George W. Bush, but he was the governor of Texas. He was famous for that. He was also a big drinker for a long period of time I believe it was when his father was in office too, he was. And so people were looking at him, who is this guy? He's just kind of like is he a hillbilly? But he wasn't. I mean, his family was like Texas almost royalty. I mean, they were pretty famous. His parents actually weren't from Texas. They were from back east, but everybody was just kind of looking at this guy, and he had this unfortunate way about him where he would just go, well, I don't know, and kind of act like he was a little on the dumb side. Okay. And people are going to take that seriously when you're running for public office. Now, he did eventually give up drinking. He went sober. He talked about his testimony. When his father was in the White House, he walked the grounds of the White House with Billy Graham, and Billy Graham led him to the Lord. So he was very clear that he was a Bible-believing Christian now. But he did this kind of put on this dumb show, which really is not a good idea for someone who's running for president, honestly. So it was between these two men, one of whom said himself to be smarter than he was. I invented the internet. I know what's going to happen in 20 years. I can save the world, to a guy who's just like, well, whatever. Someone who acts like they really don't know what's going on. Like, that's going to be helpful. It's not. Bush did unashamedly identify himself as a born-again Christian. He was very open about it. And he did say, my faith is an integral part of my whole being. That's what faith is. I don't think you can separate your faith from who you are. So he claimed that he was a born-again Christian. He testified publicly about his faith in Jesus Christ. And the media took that and ran with it and said, well, if we put this man in the White House, he's going to try to force everyone to become a Christian. That was not what he said. He was talking about his very personal faith in Christ. He is also famous for saying this: if you're a Christian, Jew, or Muslim, you're equally an American. That's the great thing about America, is the right to worship the way you see fit. That didn't get reported a whole lot. Okay, there was controversy over the election results. Big controversy. George W. Bush was declared the victor. Democrats disputed the vote and demanded a recount in certain key states or key Florida counties. And the liberal media accused Bush of stealing the election. So let me just break down what happened here. There were counties in Florida that were using a new type of ballot. It was called the butterfly ballot. And the way it was set up, when it was open, the holes that you were supposed to punch in, you were supposed to use a little stylus to punch in a hole on a card. And then the cards would be read by a computer. Well, the way the holes were set up, when you opened the butterfly ballot up, the holes didn't always directly match up with the name. And so a lot of people punched a hole and they said, wait a minute, who did I vote for? I meant to vote for this person, but it looks like I actually voted for this person. And that became a big issue because they reported it to the Electoral Commission in Florida. And they said, these ballots are incredibly confusing. I think I ended up voting for someone I didn't mean to vote for. Can you please look into it? And as a result of that, the people of the United States said, well, we need a recount of what's going on in these counties. And when they did the recount, it was kind of a sad commentary on American politics. They had volunteers go in, and most of the volunteers were very openly Democrat, looking for more votes for their candidate. And they would go in, they get big trash bags full of these ballots that had been pushed, and they would hand count the ballots to see how many votes went towards which candidate. But they discovered that some of the ballots weren't pushed in all the way. They were just what they called dimpled. And some people said, well, what if they meant to choose this one and not the one that they chose? Do we choose the dimpled ballot? And it became this huge mess. And this election went on and on and on because it took them forever to finally figure out what the count was. But when they did, the later counts proved that George W. Bush had won the election fairly, even in the disputed counties in Florida. Remember, the president is chosen by electoral college, which means that people who are in a very small state, but there's a large concentration of people, they get a certain number of votes. People in a large state with fewer population, a smaller population, they get so many votes. This is to allow everybody in the United States to have a voice in their electoral college or in the election, rather than just one or two big cities in big state or in states. Okay. If we did just a population or a popular vote, then all of our presidents would be chosen by New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago. It would only be by big cities that would choose the president for everybody else in the nation. And that's not really a fair representation of who is voting across the nation. If you need to get more information on this, and it is a very difficult thing to kind of explain, I strongly suggest you go on to Prager University's website. You can find them on YouTube. Just type in PragerU Electoral College. PragerU is not a university, and they don't claim to be. That's just the name of their company, okay? It's Prager University because they're educating people. They're not an actual brick and mortar university. They don't do correspondence courses. They don't claim to, but it's there for people who want to continue to educate themselves, specifically in areas of politics. So go to PragerU, Prager. That's the man's name who started it, Prager. And then look up electoral votes, and they have a really good video that explains how the electoral college works. Okay, look up electoral college, not electoral votes. It's really good. Okay, Bush ended up winning. He became the 43rd president and the second man in American history to have a father who had previously been president. Look at that. So the previous one. Okay, I gotta look it up now because Benjamin Harrison must have been the grandson of William Henry Harrison. I always thought they were connected. Okay. The first one, though, was the Adams, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Okay. One of Bush's first acts as president was to stop the flow of U.S. funds to international family planning groups that offered abortion services and counseling. The number one in the United States, and it actually is pretty prevalent around the world, is Planned Parenthood. They claim that they do a lot of services and that abortion services are only 3% of what they offer. They say that they do 41% of their services are to provide for sexually transmitted diseases or infectious treatments and testing. 10% is for cancer screening and prevention. 11% for any other women's health services. Only 3% is for abortion services, 1% for other services, and then they have other and other. I don't know how they do that. And then finally, 34% for contraception. They hand out very inexpensive contraception. Those contraception is used to prevent pregnancy. However, this statistic, even though it is in all of their literature, and all of the people who support Planned Parenthood use these statistics, they have been proven to be false. They have been debunked, but Planned Parenthood still uses them. Their supporters still use these statistics, even though they're false, because it's easy to remember. And if they just say it long enough, people will begin to believe it. So let's talk about what that is all about. According to Planned Parenthood, every single thing they do within a visit is considered a service. So let's say this woman is going in for an abortion, which they say is only 3% of their service. She has to take a pregnancy test. Okay. That's one service, her taking a pregnancy test to prove she's pregnant in the first place. Second would be the abortion itself. That's one service. Third would be a screening for sexually transmitted disease. That's a third service. And fourth would be contraception to prevent another pregnancy. That would be 4 services. If you did the math on this, that would mean that only 25% of the service that they provided for this woman was the abortion. Even though that is the most expensive service, that is the most significant service that they've provided. So if you want a really good video on this statistic and how it's been debunked over time, and not just by Live Action, who created this video, it's excellent, by the way, but by major newspapers have also looked at it and said, this is not correct math, not at all. So if you want to look at the whole video, I can't show it because I'll get dinged and then I'll have to re-record the entire lecture. Go to Live Action. It's also on YouTube, and look up 3% Planned Parenthood or Planned Parenthood math, and this video will come up. Okay. Okay, now let's talk about why Planned Parenthood is such a hot topic for people in government. The Democratic Party in particular really pushes for Planned Parenthood to get lots and lots of government funding. And it seems a little odd that they would just really push for this one specific company to get a lot of public funding. Not necessarily clinics for all women's health care. There are lots of clinics out there who treat women and children in a variety of ways. Planned Parenthood does not do that. Planned Parenthood, even though it's called Planned Parenthood, does not offer prenatal care. That's for women who are pregnant and are planning to keep their babies. They do not offer that. They claim to offer cancer screenings, and they will do some cancer screenings that require if it's a uterine cancer screening, but they don't do mammograms because most of Planned Parenthoods do not have mammograms. A lot of the health care that would be for women is not even part of the Planned Parenthood operations. How they work is primarily for abortion. Okay, that is their primary thing. So, but when you follow the money of Planned Parenthood, you can understand why so many politicians are really pushing for Planned Parenthood to be funded by the government, and they object to any and all fund or government funding cuts. And also anytime abortion itself is being addressed as we need to restrict abortion, those same politicians will come out and say, no, you're messing with women's rights if you do that, even though it has nothing to do with women's rights. So let's talk about the plan here. If we look at the Planned Parenthood machine, okay, Planned Parenthood receives over $500 million in taxpayer money from the federal government every year. $500 million goes to this corporation. Planned Parenthood reports $127 million in profit, but they would have lost $400 million in 1 year and shut its doors without tax funding. They have to have that tax funding. And the way they get that funding is by sending it in and having it billed to Medicare, and then it's sent back to them. Since 2008, Planned Parenthood and its affiliates, those are all the individual Planned Parenthood centers and those that are connected with them, they have increased election campaigns contributions by over $19 million. Hold it right there. So this company that gets $500 million a year from the federal government, who would go broke if they didn't have $500 million given to them by the federal government every year, then turns around and contributes to campaigns for politicians who will protect Planned Parenthood. That's fishy. That's shady. And that should be illegal. They had a report of $127 million in profit, but in 2008 and 2010, they gave $3,380,000 to campaigns. In 2012 and 2014, they gave $22,730,000 to Democratic candidates. 99% of that is for Democratic candidates. This is the real reason why Planned Parenthood is so heavily funded by the U.S. government, because these politicians know that they'll get some of that money back in campaign donations. This is why people who are not for Planned Parenthood, like me, I'm going to be real honest with you, I think it's a disgusting business. We are against it, but a lot of politicians aren't, and they will use all the hot topic phrasing like it's women's rights, it's my body, my choice, you're not taking care of women. This company does not take care of women. They perform procedures that are not necessary to life. They do not offer basic health care at all. They offer really just a few services that have to do with contraception, STDs, and of course, abortion is their number one money maker. They make money off of abortion, a lot of money. Okay. Now, to promote economic recovery, President Bush signed legislation implementing the first substantial tax cut since the Reagan years. His father said no new taxes, and then he ended up raising taxes because Congress was just, putting out bill after bill after bill that had needed tax money. And he said, okay, I'm going to kind of dial back what my dad did, dial back what Clinton did when he was in office, and we are going to cut taxes. And when he did, guess what? People had more money to spend, okay? Then on September 11th, 2001, the United States was shocked to discover we had been attacked. We were attacked on our soil, and it was the most deadly attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. It struck New York City, specifically these two towers right here. They're called the Twin Towers or the World Trade Center. They're both part of the World Trade Center. They are twin towers, meaning they look exactly the same. On the day that this happened, I was going to college as an adult. I dropped my kids off at school, Calvary Christian School. And as soon as they were out of the car, I always turned on the radio to listen to KFI because I listened to news radio the whole time I was going back and forth to school. And I heard the morning show host, who is usually very funny, he's very comedic, and he was talking about what was going on in New York. But I didn't know, I came in late and I didn't know what had happened. And I'm like, is he doing like a rebroadcast of something in history? What's going on here? And then, the news came on and it talked about what happened. And I went straight to my mom and dad's house on my way to college. And I knocked on their door and they opened the door. Their TV was on. They were just standing in the living room looking at the TV like, oh my goodness. And I said, you heard what happened? They said, yeah, we heard first thing this morning. So the fact that we were attacked on our soil, it was pretty scary. I went on to school and most of the school was terrified. A lot of students didn't come to school that day. Students that wore the hijabs, the head coverings, were terrified that they were going to be hurt in some way because immediately people were like, what caused this? And the threats there were there were some Middle Eastern men who were involved with this, and they were terrified, even though we were going to school with them all this time and we never would have hurt them. And it was kind of like, we would never do anything to you, but they were terrified because they were afraid of some backlash for what had happened. But when this happened, I remember working in the library at the time and the lights were turned off. It was a sign of mourning. We were in mourning and the TV was brought out and hooked up and we had the TV going on in the library, which, there's always a quiet place. So it was a time of just shock for everyone. We couldn't believe that this had happened to the United States. At 8:45, a hijacked 757 airliner suddenly slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, exploding on impact. And people who were on the street who saw it happen were in shock, but they thought it was an accident. Then, while they were looking at it and people were actually filming the tower as it was on fire, a second 757 struck the South Tower 15 minutes later, and people actually got pictures of that one. So people didn't have pictures of the first impact, but they definitely did at the second impact. This went on, this was a whole day and a whole week, month actually, long news story because every day we were learning something new about what happened, this horrible, horrible attack on Americans. By 10:30 a.m., and let's see, it started at 8:45. By 10:30, both of the Twin Towers collapsed. 2,800 people were dead. Now, the Twin Towers collapsed because that's what they were designed to do if there was ever an attack. You remember we talked just earlier in the week that there was an attack on the World Trade Center where there was a bombing in the underground garage. The hope was to bring the whole tower down. Well, it wasn't designed to be collapsible from the bottom, but if it started collapsing in the middle or the top, the whole thing would pancake down. The reason for that is you're talking about a very tall skyscraper in a city full of skyscrapers. You don't want it to topple over and take out the building next to it. You just wanted it to collapse down, and that's exactly what happened. But it was really horrifying. A lot of people burned to death. Some people threw themselves out of windows because they'd rather die from impact of hitting the ground than be burned alive. Just awful. Some people couldn't get out. 2,800 people were among those. A lot of firefighters, a lot of police officers lost their lives as well, just trying to retrieve the bodies and the living people. A third airliner, it wasn't just in New York, a third airliner struck the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C. There were approximately 190 people who died in that attack on the Pentagon. And then there was another plane that had been hijacked. By that time, news was kind of getting out that this kind of thing, this was what was going on, that planes were being hijacked and flown into American buildings. There is speculation that that fourth plane was designed to go either into the Capitol building where our legislative branch meets or into the White House where our president lives. But that plane was actually taken down by its passengers. The passengers, understanding what they were up against, understanding that it was either crash the plane or thousands and thousands of people die, chose to give up their lives. They sacrificed their lives to protect the people that would have died had the plane made it all the way into Washington, D.C. So that fourth plane was probably bound for the White House or Capitol Hill, but it was taken down in a field in Pennsylvania. 45 people died in that Pennsylvania crash. We know what the last minutes were like on the Pennsylvania crash because a man was on the phone with his wife and telling her what they were planning to do. And they basically rushed the cockpit. They got the hijackers and basically down the plane to protect everybody. Just really horrible event in American history. Okay. Mayor Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York City at the time. He urged New Yorkers to stay home because the city was under attack. The fewer people you had on the street, the better it was for everyone. And he was a very strong presence. He wanted to make sure that the people of New York City were taken care of. He really pushed for the firefighters and the police to be as taken care of as possible. He wanted to praise them. He offered them whatever services the city could possibly provide. Now, later it became known that the hijackings were work of the radical Islamic terrorist network called Al-Qaeda, and the leader of Al-Qaeda is Osama bin Laden. Now, when all this happened, George Bush was not in Washington, D.C. He was actually at a school. I believe he was in Florida, but I'm not really sure. He was reading to small children. He was visiting a school, and he was reading to a class. And one of his aides walked in and whispered something in his ear. And there's a picture. I didn't put it on here, but you could see his face was just like, oh no. Okay, now that was when the first plane hit the first tower. The one that people assumed was an accident. He continued to read. He didn't want to panic the children. He's reading to children. He doesn't want to panic them. He doesn't want to panic. There's press in the room. He doesn't want to start something where they start getting all excited and start yelling questions. He didn't want the children to panic. And 15 minutes later, when that second plane hit and that aide came and told him what happened, he was like, okay, we're under attack. And at that point, very calmly closed the book, said goodbye, walked out. And at that point, he started taking a lot of action. But he was trying to stay calm because he was in a position where he could have caused a lot of panic and a lot of trauma in people's lives. When he was first told that it was very likely Osama bin Laden, he's like, are you sure? Because he assumed it was somebody else. Somebody his father had fought. I'm sure you guys will remember that. But I'm going to let you sit with that until tomorrow. Thank you very much for listening, and I will talk to you tomorrow.